everyone is focused on the oil price, that is the wrong number. Right now, as you are watching this, the world is locked onto a single metric. Brent crude approaching $100 a barrel. Every anchor, every analyst, every newspaper front page is treating the Strait of Hormuz as an energy crisis. And they are not wrong that energy is in crisis, but they are missing the crisis underneath the crisis. The one that arrives with a delay. The one that does not show up on an oil futures screen. The one that lands not in your gas tank, but on your dinner table. Here is the number that should terrify you. The Persian Gulf region produces nearly half of the world's urea. Urea is the world's most widely used fertilizer, the compound that makes nitrogen available to crops. The reason a single acre of American farmland can feed dozens of people. Without urea, corn yields collapse. Without corn, beef prices explode. Without beef, the entire protein supply chain for the Western world starts to buckle. Since February 28th, urea prices have surged more than 50%. Not next year, right now, today. And the spring planting season in the Northern Hemisphere is happening this week. Think about what that means. I want to show you something today that almost no one in the mainstream media has connected. Not because the data is hidden. The data is sitting in plain sight in reports from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, from CSIS, from Carnegie Endowment, from Fitch Ratings. The connection is being missed because the news cycle runs on a 24-hour clock. Food systems run on a 6 to 9 month clock. And those two clocks are completely out of sync. If you want to look behind the curtain and understand how global power actually works, hit subscribe. Let's get into the analysis. What I am going to walk you through today is not a prediction, it is a mechanism. What I am going to walk you through today is not a prediction, a structural mechanism that has already been activated, that is already running, and whose consequences are already locked in, regardless of whether the Strait of Hormuz opens tomorrow. I am going to use structural history to show you that this exact mechanism ran once before, in 1973 and 1974, and that the world was completely unprepared for what came next. I am going to use game theory to show you why the incentives of every major player in this crisis make the food shock worse, not better. And I am going to follow the data to show you exactly where this lands, in whose grocery basket, and on what timeline. Let me start with what the Strait actually carries, because most people do not know. Everyone knows the Strait of Hormuz carries oil, 20% of the world's seaborne crude, 20% of global liquefied natural gas, the largest energy choke point on Earth. That is the story the news tells. But the Strait also carries something far less dramatic and far more consequential for the people watching this video. It carries 1/3 of the entire world's seaborne fertilizer trade. 1/3. 33% of the fertilizer that farmers across South Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the United States depend on to grow their crops transits through a 34-kilometer waterway that has been effectively closed since February 28th. The Gulf region is not just an oil province, it is the world's nitrogen factory. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, and Iran together account for nearly 46% of global urea exports. Qatar alone owns the world's largest single-site urea production facility. Qatar Energy announced in early March that it was halting downstream urea production entirely after shutting down its LNG operations. One company, 1/4 of global urea export capacity, gone. Keep that number in the back of your mind because we are coming back to it. Now here is the first structural force. And this is the one that the oil-focused analysis completely misses. Nitrogen is not like oil. You can store oil for years. Strategic petroleum reserves exist in every major economy precisely because oil can be stockpiled. Nitrogen fertilizer degrades. Urea, the primary form of nitrogen fertilizer, has a shelf life measured in months, not years. And unlike oil, there are no internationally coordinated strategic fertilizer reserves. The G7 countries, the OECD, the entire architecture of global commodity management that was built after the 1970s crises was built around oil. Nobody built a strategic urea reserve. Nobody built a fertilizer version of the International Energy Agency. So when the Strait of Hormuz closes and urea stops moving, there is no buffer. There is no emergency stockpile to draw down. There is only the inventory that farmers and distributors happen to have on hand at that precise moment. And the moment the Strait closed was the worst possible moment in the agricultural calendar. Farmers in the Northern Hemisphere, across the American Midwest, across Europe, across India, apply their primary nitrogen fertilizer in March, April, and May. This is not a preference, it is an agronomic constraint. You apply nitrogen before and during planting because that is when the crop takes it up. Apply it too late and the plant cannot use it. Miss the window entirely and the yield is permanently degraded for that entire growing cycle. The CSIS reported that urea prices at the New Orleans import hub jumped 32% in a single week, from $516 per metric ton on February 27th to $683 on March 5th. In mid-December 2025, 1 ton of urea cost American farmers the equivalent of 75 bushels of corn. By March 9th, 1 ton of urea cost the equivalent of 126 bushels. In less than 3 months, the price of fertilizer relative to crop value nearly doubled. Real farmers across the Corn Belt are right now making the most consequential decision of their year with incomplete information, inadequate supply, and prices that make their cost projections unworkable. The president of the American Farm Bureau Federation wrote a letter directly to Donald Trump. The president of the South Carolina Farm Bureau said publicly that farmers are not going to be able to finance planting their crops. These are not theoretical warnings. These are current operational realities on farms that feed the country. Now, I want to go deeper because this is where most people's analysis completely breaks down. The second structural force is what I call the compounding cascade, and it is what turns a fertilizer disruption into something far more serious than a fertilizer disruption. Most people think about this problem linearly. Less fertilizer means slightly lower crop yields. Lower crop yields means slightly higher food prices. That is the naive model. The structural reality is nonlinear, because the fertilizer shock is not arriving alone. Consider what is happening simultaneously. Natural gas, which accounts for 70 to 90% of nitrogen fertilizer production costs, has seen prices surge by up to 70% since the war began. Fertilizer plants do not just buy urea, they manufacture it from natural gas. When gas prices double, production costs double. Facilities across the Middle East, but also in Europe and Asia, are shutting down or cutting output not because they cannot get raw materials, but because they cannot afford to produce at current energy costs. Russia, one of the world's largest producers of ammonium nitrate, a key nitrogen fertilizer, has suspended exports to protect its own domestic supply. China, the world's largest phosphate producer, has blocked phosphate exports for the same reason. And phosphate is not a substitute for nitrogen. It is a separate, equally essential component of fertilizer. You need nitrogen for plant growth. You need phosphate for root development and energy transfer. Block both, and the compounding effect on yields is not additive. It is multiplicative. The Carnegie Endowment put it plainly. The Gulf also produces around 20% of global phosphate fertilizers and a quarter of global sulfur. Sulfur is required to convert phosphate rock into a form that plants can absorb. Without Gulf sulfur, phosphate production outside the Gulf is also constrained. One crisis, 3 cascading inputs, nitrogen, phosphate, sulfur, all disrupted simultaneously. Think about what that means for the ordinary person at the grocery store. Not in 3 weeks, in 3 to 6 months. When the crops planted this April come to market in September and October. When the corn that is not being planted this week does not appear on grocery shelves in the fall. When the cattle that were not fed sufficient corn this year produce less beef next winter. When the bread made from wheat grown with insufficient nitrogen costs 30% more than it did a year ago. The World Food Program estimates that up to 45 million people could face life-threatening food insecurity if transit stability in the Strait of Hormuz is not fully restored. 45 million people. That is not a rounding error. That is the population of California and Texas combined. Now, I want to address the argument you are probably forming in your head, because it is a reasonable argument and I want to give it the credit it deserves before I show you why it fails. The argument goes like this. This crisis will be short-lived. The ceasefire is holding more or less. Iran allowed fertilizer shipments through the strait in late March. The blockade announced on April 13th applies to Iranian port traffic, not all transit. The market will adjust. Alternative suppliers will step up. Russia and Canada and the United States will fill the gap. The food system is resilient. It has absorbed shocks before. Every element of this argument contains truth. The ceasefire is real, even if fragile. Iran did allow some humanitarian and fertilizer shipments. Alternative producers exist. The food system is genuinely more resilient than the energy system in some respects, because food is grown locally in many countries. But here is the reality. This argument misunderstands the relationship between time and agricultural systems. The food system is resilient to sustain shocks that allow time to adjust. It is not resilient to sudden supply disruptions that arrive precisely at the moment when the seasonal window is closing. And the planting window does not wait for diplomacy. Consider the timing. Vessels traveling from the Persian Gulf to the U.S. Gulf Coast take 30 days. If the strait closes on February 28th and does not reliably reopen until April, then fertilizer that was in transit or queued for loading on February 27th does not reach American farms until late March at the earliest. Some of it never arrives at all. The CSIS reported that roughly 1 million metric tons of urea were physically stranded in Gulf ports, unable to load when the crisis began. Unable to load does not mean it will eventually ship. It means it missed the planting window entirely. That urea will not be applied to American corn this spring. The yield reduction it causes is already locked in, regardless of what happens in the Strait of Hormuz today. Now let me take you to the historical parallel, because this is not the first time an energy crisis in the Middle East produced a food crisis that the world was not watching. I want to take you to 1973 and 1974. In October 1973, OPEC declared an oil embargo against the United States and its allies in response to American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled, from roughly $3 a barrel to nearly $12 a barrel within months. The whole world watched. The whole world responded. Lines at gas stations, emergency measures, Nixon's Project Independence, Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy. The oil shock of 1973 is one of the most documented economic events of the 20th century. But here is what almost nobody talks about. In 1974, the world experienced a separate and largely forgotten food crisis. A crisis that killed millions. A crisis that swept through the Sahel region of Africa, through Bangladesh, through India, through countries that had nothing to do with the Yom Kippur War and no stake in American oil politics. The Federal Reserve's own historical record notes that Fed Chairman Arthur Burns, writing in 1979, cited the crop failures and resulting surge in world food prices in 1974 and 1975 as a distinct and compounding force in the inflation of that decade, separate from the oil shock, but structurally connected to it. The connection was fertilizer. Higher oil prices meant higher natural gas prices, which meant higher fertilizer production costs, which meant higher fertilizer prices, which meant farmers in developing countries applied less nitrogen to their crops, which meant lower yields in 1974, which meant food prices peaked not in 1973 when the oil shock happened, but in 1974, a full year later. The world was watching the oil crisis. The food crisis arrived when everyone had already turned the page. By April 1973, Thailand, the world's leading rice exporter, banned rice exports entirely to protect its own domestic supply. For 9 months, there was effectively no world rice market. When it reopened in January 1974, export prices in real terms were 4 times their prior level. 2 million people died. The World Food Conference was convened in Rome in 1974, after the crisis, after the deaths, as the world tried to understand how it had missed what was happening right in front of it. The mechanism in 2026 is structurally identical. An energy crisis in the Middle East is producing a fertilizer crisis through the same transmission channel. Disrupted supply, elevated natural gas prices, higher production costs, lower application rates. The only difference is that in 1973, the primary shock was to oil. In 2026, the primary shock is to the strait that carries both oil and fertilizer simultaneously, with the planting season beginning this week. The Fitch Ratings agency raised its 2026 urea price expectations by 25%. Oxford Economics raised its Q2 2026 fertilizer price forecast by 20% within days of the strait's closure. Wolfer Research has estimated the disruption could raise food-at-home inflation in the United States by roughly 2 percentage points. These are not worst-case projections. These are base-case projections from credible institutions. And the base case is already baked in because the planting season is already underway. Now let me tell you who gets hurt, in what order, and how soon. The first wave lands in the developing world, and it is landing now. India faces immediate exposure. Indian fertilizer manufacturers have already cut urea output because high LNG costs make production uneconomical. India's monsoon season begins in June. Fertilizer demand peaks in the weeks before it. If Indian farmers cannot get adequate nitrogen before June, rice and wheat yields fall. India is both a major importer and a major exporter of agricultural products. When India cuts its exports to protect its own supply, it removes supply from global markets, which raises global prices, which hurts Bangladesh, Kenya, Ethiopia, and every other country that depends on imported grain. Brazil, the world's largest fertilizer importer, brought in 49 million metric tons in 2025. It is deeply dependent on Middle Eastern urea. Lower Brazilian crop yields reduce the global soybean supply. Soybeans are the world's primary source of protein meal for livestock. Lower soybean supply means higher feed costs. Higher feed costs mean higher meat prices. This is not a distant or speculative chain. It is the standard transmission mechanism for how agricultural input shocks reach Western grocery stores. The second wave lands in the United States between June and September. American farmers are already making the decision right now. Some will plant less corn and switch to soybeans, which require less nitrogen fertilizer. That reduces the corn supply. Corn is the feedstock for American beef, poultry, and dairy. Corn is the input for ethanol. Corn is in hundreds of processed food products. A meaningful reduction in corn planted acreage in spring 2026 does not show up in grocery prices until fall 2026 and into 2027. The pain is delayed, it is not avoided. The third wave lands everywhere when the fall harvest data starts coming in. If yields are down 5% globally, as several analysts project under current conditions, global commodity prices enter a sustained elevation that persists well beyond the resolution of the Strait of Hormuz crisis. Because you cannot replant the spring crops that were missed. You cannot undo the nitrogen that was not applied. The harvest of 2026 is being determined by decisions being made on farms this week, with the inputs that are or are not available this month. This is what the 6 to 9 month lag means. The crisis is not coming. The crisis has already been triggered. What we are waiting for is its arrival. Let me leave you with 3 things to watch. Because the situation is still developing, and the ultimate severity of the food shock depends on variables that are still unresolved. Watch the planting reports. The USDA releases weekly planting progress reports through May. If the percentage of corn acres planted falls significantly below the 5-year average by late April, that is quantitative confirmation that the fertilizer shortage is already reducing acreage. That number will tell you more about where grocery prices are going in October than anything you will see on an oil futures screen. Watch the India monsoon season. If Indian farmers enter the June planting season with inadequate fertilizer supplies, India will restrict grain exports. India restricting grain exports triggers a cascade through global rice and wheat markets that affects food security for hundreds of millions of people who have no connection whatsoever to the Strait of Hormuz and no voice in the politics of the Iran war. Watch the fertilizer price index through May. If urea prices stabilize below $600 per metric ton, the shock is manageable. If they push toward $800 or above, the crop switching and yield reduction scenarios become much more severe, and the food inflation of late 2026 and into 2027 becomes a major economic and political force in its own right. The 1974 food crisis was largely forgotten because it arrived after the 1973 oil crisis had already dominated the headlines. Politicians who had declared victory on the oil crisis did not want to admit that its secondary consequences were still unfolding a year later. The same institutional incentive exists today. Nobody wants to talk about a food crisis when there is a war, a blockade, a ceasefire, and a diplomatic circus to cover. But the mechanism does not care about the news cycle. The crops do not care about the ceasefire. The nitrogen that was not applied to a field in Iowa this April will not be in the corn that is harvested in September. Regardless of what Trump and the Iranian foreign minister agree to in Islamabad or anywhere else. This is not prophecy. This is structural history combined with game theory. The mechanism was identified. The historical precedent is documented. The data is public. The timeline is fixed by biology, not by politics. I might be wrong about the severity. I might be wrong about the timing. If I am wrong, we will come back and analyze why. But the direction of this analysis I am confident about. If you are asking where the next major economic shock to ordinary American families comes from, the answer is not the oil price. It is the grocery store receipt. And the clock on that started running on February 28th. Save this analysis, come back in September, check the harvest reports, check the grocery inflation numbers. Check whether anyone else was talking about this in April. The answers will tell you everything about whether structural analysis is more useful than the daily news cycle. Subscribe if you want to keep following the logic wherever it leads.